happening here. Obviously, with the ongoing pandemic and growing climate crisis concern, the topic of climate change has never been more pressing for us. I mean, an obvious example of how much life has changed since the start of 2020 is even just the format of this event. This shift in lifestyle and interactions has made the action-based climate activism scene very difficult, with measures like social distancing that are put to keep us safe. But because of that, we've had to radically change our methods of outreach by focusing more on online interactive platforms, such as the one we're currently using. And I think it's a really good reminder of how adaptable we can be in the face of a crisis. The report being covered today conveys the urgency of the climate crisis and proposes a step in the right direction for Northern Ireland. As a country, we're already feeling the effects of issues such as air pollution. I think one of the statistics was that me and Anna use quite a lot in activism is 1 in 24 people in Belfast die from air pollution related causes every year. On top of that, Belfast has the second highest level of air pollution in the whole of the UK. And also keep in mind, we are also an island nation, so sea level rise is a very real and dangerous threat to us. According to the most recent flood projection maps, places like Derry and Belfast will be entirely uninhabitable before 2050. This is not a problem for future generations to deal with, and it will affect my generation. We have to take responsibility for this, and that's why I think a climate action plan for Northern Ireland is absolutely vital. So I'll pass on to the chair.
That's wonderful, Caitlin. Thank you very much. And I'd like to add my welcome to Caitlin's, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Barry. I'm co-director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action here at Queen's University. I mean, what a momentous week we've had. We all are waiting with bated breath, of course, to see the white smoke going up later on, to see which Conservative or version of Conservatism wins the DUP leadership. But we've also this week seen, in a way, the past of Northern Ireland, the Ballymurphy inquest, and the fantastic, findings of the report that everybody was entirely innocent. A reminder, if we needed, of course, of our unfinished past and its legacy. But it's rather overshadowed a more positive development that on Monday, the climate change bill, and welcome Claire Bailey here, passed its second stage. And the issue with the climate change bill is obviously very pertinent to our discussion today. And it's also future orientated. And for me, it's a phrase I use quite a bit, is that we tend in Northern Ireland to march into the future looking backwards. And we often give less attention to turning around and looking ahead at the future of this coming decades and century, while not denigrating or dismissing the importance of dealing with our troubled past. So this week is quite an interesting bookending of legacy and looking forward to the future. And I hope that what we can do today is really look to the future. And that's why it's great to have Caitlin from the Youth Strike for Climate and Fridays for the Future here today. So today's event is on how to build back better, although I'd like to call it how to build back better, maybe Belfast, but that's maybe too much alliteration on a Friday afternoon. New thinking for post-pandemic Northern Ireland. And what we're going to use is a recently published Friends of the Earth report called Climate Action Plan for Northern Ireland, a Green and Fair Recovery for People and Communities, as a jumping off point for our discussion. If you haven't read it, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. And not just because we have the author or one of the main authors of the report here to present it, Declan Allison, but it's really short. It's packed full of fantastic science and fact-based arguments in terms of how we should move to a regenerative, green, low-carbon economy. So I'd like to congratulate Declan and Friends of the Earth for producing this. So just to let you know, I'll just describe the event, what we're going to be doing. We're going to record today's event. So if you don't want to have your face on the recording, just turn off your camera. And I'd ask you the usual format in terms of the etiquette. Can you turn off your mic if you're not speaking? So the format for today is going to be that Declan from Friends of the Earth will give a summary of the report. That'll be followed then by a couple of responses. Probably two. We had hoped for 3 people to respond, but unfortunately Kerry Fleck has had to be called away on trade union business unless she's joined us. So firstly, we will have, after Declan's presentation, responses from the Reverend Gerald Maven, Presbyterian chaplain at Ulster University, Jeff Nuttall, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at NICFA, and I do think I see a KF on my screen. I think Kerry is here, Kerry Fleck, trade union activist. And after they've given their responses, we'll then have an open discussion, which I'll moderate and chair, and then we'll aim to finish at around 2:30. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Declan.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, John, for bringing us all together, and Theresa as well for, like, I imagine, doing most of the legwork here. But I should also thank my colleague in our head office, Mike Childs, who actually wrote most of the report, although I'm happy to take John's credit. So I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this will work fine. You can let me know if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can, Declan.
Okay, good. So I'll do this. So so this is really based on this convergence, would say, of four major issues. We have climate breakdown, which is becoming even more evident as time goes by. Ecological collapse, and we've seen that with decline in soil fertility levels, decline in bees and other pollinators, decline in fish populations in the oceans. So we're seeing major problems with the environment outside of climate. Also, obviously, more pressing just at the moment for all of us will be the global pandemic. And I think the prediction is that this is really just one of many events that we're likely to see in the future as wildlife gets squeezed into smaller and smaller areas, and their populations become very dense, and then dense human populations interact with those dense populations of wildlife, and then we see this, transfer of unusual and new diseases, and finally then growing inequalities. I think, during the course of this pandemic, the world's richest people have increased their combined wealth by $5 trillion or something obscene like that. Meanwhile, we have people in India dying for want of oxygen, and other massive inequalities that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So the report then highlights, I think, 5 areas, kind of priority areas that we should be looking at, and I'll go through each of these in a wee bit more detail, but just quickly, we have empowering communities to lead recovery. This is about a democratic revival, about participative democracy, not simply tick box consultative kind of exercises. Introduction of a Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill. We've seen this in Wales, and we want to replicate that. And it's something that's going pretty well in Wales. Develop and use a living standards framework. This is following on from I think the New Zealand model, where they're pioneering this kind of idea, replacing the slightly crude and outdated GDP with well-being measures. Power Northern Ireland with renewable electricity. We need a fairly rapid transformation of our energy sector to electricity. We can't rely on fossil fuels anymore for heating or electricity generation or for transport. And then finally, reverse the decline in nature. And we see pretty dramatic examples of that in Northern Ireland, where we see development coming up, very strongly against nature, whether it's the A6 proposal that drove a motorway-sized road through the middle of a wetland, or sand dredging in Lough Neagh, or lots of minerals exploration and fracking exploration, all having these negative impacts on wildlife. Industrial farming would be another major one. So empower communities. So what we're looking for here is a community bill of rights. So that's given rights to local communities at a council level to decide what happens in their area, and that's important for a democratic revival, for democratic decision making. Our decision making at the moment is largely done through kind of consultative and very prescriptive tick box exercises where people are led down a certain direction. You know, a list of questions. What do you think of these points? And you know that the consultation is leading people to a certain already preconceived decision. And that's not remotely democratic. It's not really participative. It's not transparent. So we need this community bill of rights to put democracy, transparency, and participation at the heart of local decision making. And that kind of links into the next point: reform of the planning system. The people's involvement in planning is really based largely on speculative planning applications, and then people get the opportunity to have a say in a very limited way in a limited time frame. And it's, you know, people are essentially locked out of this. You know, by the time communities understand the implications of a certain development, you know, the time for the consultation is almost up, you know, and there's no time to mobilize any kind of local opposition, or it doesn't even need to be opposition. It could be just a way of feeding into the system and suggesting amendments, but it's too prescriptive, it's too short. And at the other end of that, then a developer has the opportunity to appeal if a planning application is refused, but local communities don't have the opportunity to appeal if a planning application is approved. So we want to see, as part of this reform of the planning system, an equal right of appeal. So front-loaded at the start of the process, and then with an equal right of appeal at the end of it. So we have this full-length opportunity for people to get fully involved, to fully participate. Establish specialised environmental courts. So we have specialised courts on all sorts of areas. We have, you know, children's courts, we have business courts, we have other specialised courts, but we have no specialised environmental courts. So as I was saying, with the lack of an appeal mechanism for objectors, the only recourse then for a local community, if a planning application that they are objecting to is approved, the only recourse for them is a judicial review. And that doesn't look at the merits of the case, it only looks at whether or not the decision has been made legally or not. So it's a very narrow focus. It's also very daunting, and it can be extremely expensive. And the judges here in those cases aren't specialist environmental lawyers. So they're really being led by the barristers, and it just comes down to whose barrister is the most convincing rather than the merits of the case. So we want to see some specialised environmental courts where the judges are specialist, dedicated environmental lawyers. And then finally, we're looking at setting up Aarhus centres. So the UK is a signatory to the Aarhus Convention, which sets out these 3 pillars of access to information, right to participate in decision making, and access to justice. So these things are a bit unknown by most people. Most communities won't really know of the Aarhus Convention or know that the UK is a signatory to it. So we want to see these Aarhus centres set up, which will then support local communities, you know, inform them about their rights, about those 3 primary rights. Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill. So again, modelled on the 2015 Welsh Act, and that is going very well. And it places a requirement on public bodies to consider the long-term impacts of any decisions that they're making. So it's kind of a multi-generational impact assessment. And I think that's very important, given the climate implications. We need the long-term impacts to be considered. Given the decline of nature, again, we need these kind of holistic, global, long-term considerations. And then finally, it establishes a Future Generations Commissioner to guide and support public bodies to ensure compliance. So it's not a regulatory body, really. It's more of a support body, just to make sure that government is doing the right thing, or decision-making bodies are doing the right thing. So we're looking at developing using the Living Standards framework. So this is pioneered by New Zealand, and it's still quite a young scheme, quite a young proposal. So we can't really say how well it's going, but we can talk about what the principles are. And the main point here is that it is to replace gross domestic product. We know GDP is the primary measure for how well an economy is doing, but it's a very blunt instrument. It doesn't consider things like happiness and well-being. It doesn't really consider the health of people, except insofar as they may buy goods, they may buy medicines, they may spend time in hospital, or they may be seeing a GP. As long as they're spending money, then GDP will measure wealth implications, but then only poor people are generally doing these, or not poor people, sick people are doing this. So actually sickness is a beneficial thing as far as GDP is concerned to an extent. Pollution is good for GDP because it costs money to clean it up, and companies are involved in the cleanup, and there's lots of equipment used to clean it up, and disposal costs money and all the rest of it. So that's good. Crime is good for GDP because people buy stuff that's been stolen, to replace it. They invest in home security measures, and more police are recruited. So again, that's good for GDP. But clearly, these things are not good for people's well-being, and they're not good for people's happiness. They're not good for social cohesion. So it's a blunt and crude mechanism. So we want to see it focused, the economy focused towards well-being rather than GDP. Power Northern Ireland with renewable electricity. So there are some important principles here. We need to transform our energy sector very, very rapidly, but we can't just do it without consideration of the implications of that. So some of the principles we're talking about here are an appropriate technology at an appropriate scale in an appropriate location. So a huge industrial anaerobic digester with a combined heat and power plant stuck in the middle of the countryside that relies on grass growing, in a 10-mile radius or whatever. That's not really an appropriate technology. Anaerobic digestion for organic waste is great, but we need to look at the location and the scale rather than simply saying renewables are good, let's have lots of renewables. And a part of that, of course, is that community participation and cooperative ownership is important. So a community that's going to be hosting renewable technologies, whether it be anaerobic digesters or wind farms or solar farms, we need to have their buy-in for it. Otherwise, it's not really a just transition if things are being forced upon people. So this is back to those earlier points about participative decision making and democratic decision making. This is key to our just transition to a low carbon future. An electric first strategy. So at the moment we have the statutory duty to promote natural gas. That is completely in opposition to the direction we should be going. So we need to scrap that. We need to bring in moratoria on exploration of fossil fuels, and we need to focus in our energy strategy on electric first. So that means renewables, but it also means storage capacity, whether that be battery storage or long-term heat storage. And we need also, as part of that, we need to be electrifying the transport system. And an absolutely key part of this is introduction of a Green New Deal. So it's not enough to simply have lots of electric heat. We also need to insulate people's homes, businesses, public buildings as well, in order to maximize the efficiency and the energy use that we're getting out of all this, all these renewables that we're putting in place. And reverse the decline in nature. So absolutely key to this is an independent environmental protection agency, and these arguments have been well rehearsed for decades. We've been campaigning on this for as long as I can remember, and we keep getting knocked back. The last time we had it, apparently the environment was too important to be given to an outside agency. It had to be done entirely by the DUP controlled environment department. But I won't maybe dwell on that. We know that we need independence, and we need a well-funded and well-resourced environment agency. A transition plan for farmers. This is absolutely key because so much of this, whether it be reducing emissions or reversing the decline in nature, it has to come from farmers. And we know from the debate on the climate bill that farmers are concerned about the impacts that any reduction in greenhouse gas emissions will have on their industry. And that's fair enough. So what we need is a just transition plan for farmers. So it's not simply, okay, you can no longer raise cattle, or you can no longer, do whatever it is that we're having problems with industrial farming of pigs and sheep and chickens, whatever it happens to be. It's not enough to say you can no longer do that. We need a transition for them, and that is about diversifying their industry, and it's also about recognizing that they are custodians of the land, and therefore they should be paid to be custodians of the land and be able to earn enough to have that as a viable part of their role. Given legal rights to nature, again, we've seen this pioneered in many places across the world, New Zealand, India, many parts of South America. And it's just recognizing that places, landscapes, rivers, mountains, forests have a right to exist for their own sake, not simply as something that humans can make use of as a resource, or even just for our well-being as a pleasant place for us to visit. They have a right to exist for their own sake. And it's quite a radical concept, but we do see it happening across the world. A peat restoration plan. Peat bogs are absolutely vital again as sinks for greenhouse gases, and so we need to restore these. We've seen a massive decline of them, and that needs to be reversed. And then finally here, make Lough Neagh a peace park. Again, Lough Neagh is quite an iconic part of Northern Ireland. It sits right at the centre of the country. It's seen as another county in many ways. It's bordered by most of our counties, and it's under threat. Again, we've seen declines in wading bird populations, fish populations, insect populations. Sand dredging in Lough Neagh has caused a lot of difficulties there. So given its iconic nature, we're thinking that, if it was a peace park, it kind of then becomes that iconic emblem of our transition into a greener future. So guiding principles then, we must act immediately. There's debate over the targets. We see the minister saying 82% reduction in emissions by 2050. We have our the bill that has just recently passed its second stage, saying zero carbon by 2045. Whatever really end target we're going for, the point is we need to act quickly, and we need to have a rapid decline in our emissions. And it has to be a just transition. People can't be left behind. We can't have industries left stranded. We can't have people left unemployed. And we can't have people who are maybe less able to afford it, or they live in places of multiple deprivation where they don't have access to the countryside. They don't have access to clean food or good quality fresh food. People can't be left behind in this transition. And Northern Ireland can't disproportionately use finite resources. So in theory, we could design this perfect zero carbon energy system for Northern Ireland, with electric buses and every house being a power station, every business being a power station, public land used for generating electricity and for forestry and for allotments and urban orchards and all sorts of stuff. We could do all sorts of wonderful stuff in theory and have that done in the next 10 years, for example. But if that means we're using a disproportionate amount of resources, for example, gold or steel or copper or rare earth minerals for all our renewables, if we're disproportionately using those resources, then it's not a just system that we have put in place. If we're dumping our pollution onto other people, or if we're destroying other people's environment in order to get those finite resources, then we can't consider it a just transition. It's not a just solution, and it's not one that we should be putting in place. And then finally here, democracy, transparency, and community participation are central. It's not going to work unless it has buy-in from people, and people won't buy into it unless it's democratic and transparent. So just to finish there, This document is just suggestions, really, recommendations. It's things that can be done. It's not a prescriptive list of what must be done. It's just our suggestion of what could be done. And there are lots of references in it. So people can go away and they can read up on it and they can come to their own conclusions. But whatever happens, it has to be done participatively. That's a difficult word to keep saying over and over again. Participatively and democratically, and at an assembly level, and also at a council level and a community level. So I'll leave it there, and then we can go to other speakers.
That's great. Declan, thank you very much. If it was a piece of work I was grading, I'd give you a mid first. I wouldn't give you a high first because you didn't correctly reference, young man. It's not enough just to put the URLs in at the end of the document. Sorry, that's the pedantic professor. No, it is a really good piece of work. So we're going to pass over now to Cheryl and then to Jeff for their responses. But thank you very much, Declan. You've also shown us the proper way to use PowerPoint. Very simple, visually attractive. So thanks for the lesson. Cheryl.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Declan. Now, we might have had a communication breakdown because the response that I have written is to the Friends of the Earth green and fair recovery plans across the UK, not specifically to Northern Ireland. There's lots of overlap in what you've said, but it's not exactly the same document. So do you want me to talk or do you want me not to talk?
Absolutely, horse on there.
And a horse on. Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation to contribute to today's conversation. I can't claim to speak for everyone from faith denomination. Even within my own church, I'm not exactly known as central in my views. So in order not to spend my whole time qualifying everything I say, please just understand that I'm speaking from a particular faith perspective. The basic outlines of it are this: that Scripture affirms our whole earth as belonging to God and not as some afterthought, but as intentional and much loved creation, each part of it called good, until the creation of humanity, which is called very good. The picture is of God in fellowship with humanity, human beings representing God's physical presence on earth, living in harmonious and creative relationship with all of creation to honor God who created it. So the story of where things went wrong is depicted as the result of human beings moving from the abundance they have received into a mindset of scarcity. Only one limit was given to them, but they think they have to have that one more thing in order to make themselves what they were already made to be. And this living without limits, going beyond what is already abundant and more than enough, throws their relationship with each other, with God, and with the whole of creation into chaos. And this place of brokenness is the locus of our present conversation. So our plans for creation must now take account of the selfishness and greed, the acquisitiveness which has become our way of being. And I think that the policy document for the UK that I've read attempts to build in taxes on polluting industries that accepts and acknowledges the acquisitiveness of humanity, though it perhaps doesn't get to the heart of it. As a child, I was taught about Noah and the great flood and God washing away vast swathes of human and animal life to get rid of the abusive practices that were taking place. But instead of destroying everything, life was preserved and allowed through Noah and his massive conservation project to repopulate the earth. And God's gift to Noah of the rainbow was a sign of a promise that God would never again destroy the world by flood. What I was told then, and what looks increasingly likely now, is that the world as we know it will be destroyed not by flood, but by fire. Unless, that is, something changes in our humanity. So how can the policy changes such as those in the Friends of the Earth paper get under the skin of our being human to change the hearts which drive our behaviours? The policy document aligns with the faith commitment to challenge injustice, and Declan has really underlined that very strongly in his presentation, to seek the welfare of all, especially the poorest. It calls out the refusal of governments to use effective tax incentives to charge polluting industries for the damage they inflict on health and environment. That reticence of governments to use that tax power needs to be challenged. Scriptures affirm God's ongoing, persistent love for the whole world in the face of empires and invasions and devastation and abuses of power. The prophets affirm the priority of the widows, the orphan, care for the poor, and by extension, all those who are systemically marginalized by unjust use of power. And so I'm encouraged by the document's concern to address fuel poverty, as Declan also mentioned, to ensure proper insulation and heat efficiency in the poorest homes and in all homes. Inefficiency of cheaper properties exposes residents to higher fuel bills, dirtier fuels, more potential damp or cold related health problems. No faith community can commend such a situation as desirable. The Bible recognizes the mess, but it also promises redemption, a new creation, the kingdom of God, not discontinuous from this one, but as a child born from the pregnant old creation, bearing the same genes perhaps, but growing its own distinctive personality, different from its tired mother. So there are good reasons for Christian communities to support the transition that these policies are seeking. Indeed, this document feels to me like an important part of the gestation of the new earth. People are called to live according to the new life. That means according to the qualities of character and relationship that will thrive in the new creation. The promise we have is of love, generosity, mercy, kindness, gentleness, patience, joy, faithfulness. There's no room for greed or selfishness or abuses of power in the new kingdom. So I commend the document for its compassionate eye to invest, for example, proactively in green employment, just as you were talking about transitions in agriculture, but also across the UK in sustainable industries. Winning the battle for sustainable energy without providing meaningful work and incomes would be futile, but embodying justice in our ways of transitioning is very much the way of the kingdom. One of the particular strengths of the tradition of Reformation that I've inherited, and part of its unfinished business, is declericalization, putting into the hands of everyone the responsibility for their right relationships with the Creator and with our fellow creatures and the world we live in. And the Spirit who lives within all of us, the resurrection life who goes beyond persecution, even crucifixion, to receive life as a gift. In the new creation, the kingdom of God comes not from the top down, from who is in power, but from the power of love that grows like yeast in the dough, engaging its own life to transform everything around it. And the spirit of what Declan has said very much resonates with that. And the document that I've read, its reference to development of critical thinking and creative engagement in education is an important part of this, very much in line with a faith commitment to invest courageously, as Jesus encouraged us to do, for an abundant return by investing in people and relationships rather than hoarding and accumulating stuff. So I wholeheartedly commend the document's eschewing of GDP. It's a misleading measure of economic health and it leads us into lies. I celebrate your determination to point economic strategy in the direction of increasing well-being and restoring the environment. And the document is right to question the eye-watering sums spent on, and still to be spent on, the highly environmentally destructive HS2 project, when the same money could be spent so much more constructively in ways that are mentioned in the document. From within faith communities, there will be a caution, perhaps on the apparent focus on the material and the physical, rather than spiritual and relational growth. Also, the amount of government expenditure and control implicit within a number of their policies might have the unintended effect of undermining the sense of personal responsibility, which is the true power that changes how things happen. On the other hand, the Judeo-Christian God loves matter. His Son became physical and human. That's a physical and material are important because of his incarnation and his care for bodies as well as souls. So the intentional empowerment of communities to lead recovery, as well as the proposal to invest in green jobs, especially training for young people, not only equips those employed with the means to live, but potentially invests their experience with the ideas and the mindset to continue developing healthier, more life-giving ways of living and working. It's a shift in culture which might help to bring humanity to the tipping point of transformation. There's confidence within Christianity that what has to be overcome is not individual human opponents, but rather the systems of belief, the social or maybe antisocial habits of behaviour, acquiring stuff to shore up a sense of security, and the exercise of power embedded in cultures and customs. But you should confidently commend the spirit of the Friends of the Earth document that I've read, which I see spelt out in what Declan has shared. Commend it to faith groups, ask for their responses, see whether some of the suspicion and fear of the Green Lobby as an atheist or communist extremist group, which is sort of floating around in the ether out there, if that can be diffused or even replaced with wholehearted endorsement. Our habits might be transformed by the persistent implementation of many of the proposals that you make. How to get support for these policies is a challenge, and the values reflected in the spirit of what you said resonate profoundly with the life-giving values of the kingdom of God. So let us deeply embody those values in the lives of the people who preach them. If not, like the churches, you'll let yourselves down. The way we go about relationships internally and externally, engaging with politicians, multinational corporations, individual civilians, even faith groups, to gain support for proposals, will be the determining factor in whether they live or die. And I say that as someone who follows a leader who died, who was executed. It's not going to be easy. But insofar as you inhabit the life and values of the Creator, the life of the Creator will inhabit you, and hopefully all of us, in a global habitat which flourishes and nurtures the creatures designed to live in it. So I commend your work with the caution that we need to keep openness to change ourselves and to fully embody the principles and the love of the one who has made us. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for a very eloquent and informed perspective. And I perhaps should explain, you know, for many of you, it may not be a usual response to have from a faith position. But I do think it's important that we include as diverse a number of voices in this discussion. And certainly I had a quick chat with Cheryl before we went live about, you know, maybe having some events just particularly around the faith communities. And it's great to hear that perhaps on this day of our Lord, the 14th of May, that Presbyterians for Post-Growth was born. Presbyterians for the post-carbon world was born. Maybe even Presbyterians for a post-capitalist future. But anyway, that's maybe getting too far ahead of myself. But listen, thank you so much, Cheryl. And I wonder if you've typed up your comments, would you be willing to share those with the group? And just to let you know, because of the efficiency of the modern way we're working, Declan has emailed myself and Teresa his PowerPoint. So if anyone would like a copy of Declan's PowerPoint, just drop myself or Teresa Hill, our centre manager, an email. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over now to Jeff. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, John. Difficult to follow, Cheryl, but I will do my best. So, I mean, first of all, thanks to Friends of the Earth and to Queen's for inviting me to speak really from a voluntary community social enterprise sector perspective. And So I was just going to make a few comments about the kind of main actions and the priorities in the plan, because I think the main thing that strikes me is there's a huge alignment between what this document's saying and a whole range of other agendas in the wider voluntary community sector. So I think there's lots of opportunity to reinforce the messages, and so I'm looking forward to that. I suppose I should declare an interest of having spent 16 years of my working life in various environmental organizations, and it's very, very good to see the climate bill finally going through. You tend to find in the environment sector that about 10 years after you've given up banging on about something, it becomes mainstream. So that's really good to see. So just to say a few things about the five areas. The first action, empowering communities to lead the recovery and encouraging participation and participatory decision making. And this is absolutely in tune with a lot of the things that we as NICFA are talking with various parts of the sector and with others about. Things like the Community Foundation Northern Ireland's Community Voice campaign, which is trying to ensure that some of the commitments in New Decade, New Approach to things like citizens' assemblies are carried forward. And the idea of climate change being one of those subjects, has come up many times. We as NICFA as well are also developing an initiative called Manifesto for Change, which is about the relationship between our sector and government. And one of the three key priorities is what we're calling valuing the voice, which is all about developing structures and mechanisms to enable community voices and community multi-sector voices to inform policy and to inform the way that plans like this are developed. So it absolutely aligns with that, and I think there's lots of support across our sector for exactly what you're saying. Action 2 on the Future Generations Bill, at the end of 2019, before COVID hit, we had a big conference in NICFA along with Northern Ireland Environment Link to feed into the then consultation on the environment strategy for Northern Ireland. And we had a very broad range of people in that audience, and we together agreed a common purpose for the environment statement and a whole range of asks within that, one of which was a Future Generations Bill. I think it shows that I think the Future Generations Bill is something that reaches well beyond the usual environmental suspects, if you like, into something which everyone can understand and appreciate, in couching things in terms of what our future generation will inherit. I think is something that everyone can get behind. So absolutely wholeheartedly support that. Action 3, getting rid of GDP as a measure, absolutely something that we in NICFA I think would be very keen to support. For a long time, we've been trying to encourage different measures of societal well-being that are not purely economic, not purely narrowly focused on GDP. So even things like the outcomes-based approach in the programme for government, looking at things from an outcome for society, is anyone better off, is far more useful than assuming that because GDP has risen by 5%, that people are better off. And I think, obviously there have been a number of attempts to look at different. I remember the New Economics Foundation talking about the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare as another alternative to GDP many years ago. We're open to discussion on any sort of model that is broader, that thinks about the three legs of the stool of sustainability, of economic, social, and environmental. So, absolutely support exploring that. I think as well, the COVID experience has shown that it's kind of shone a light on the needs of society and the inequalities in society. It's also highlighted how voluntary community organizations respond to those crises very quickly. And I think while we're in this moment of having responded to that and having seen looking at things differently, that we need to maintain some of that and not revert back to a simple focus on narrow economic indicators. The Action 4 on powering Northern Ireland with renewable electricity. I mean, I know from my past lives in a number of organizations that there's a huge resource for us, and we are already tapping into that resource. A number of years ago in WWF, we did a report showing that the island of Ireland could be conservatively estimated to be able to meet its electricity needs through renewables very easily and potentially sell excess through the grid. So there's no shortage of opportunity. And we also have all the other elements of a manufacturing base, a research capacity, all of the elements for promoting renewable energy on our doorstep that could be tapped into a lot more. As NICFA, we've just completed an energy audit of our building, and we're getting a baseline emissions assessment done in order to inform a first target towards net zero in 2025. And I think what strikes me is that, and maybe this is something to think about, is what there's a lack of is low cost or free advice and support in the area of renewables and energy generally. 10 years ago, there are a lot more organizations around doing this. And, you know, we've done very well of squeezing a lot of free advice out of various people, and Action Renewables have been particularly useful to us and business in the community as well. But I think there's a lot of willingness to get involved, but maybe not a lot of knowledge, and not a lot of knowledge as to who can actually support people. So I think that's something to think about. I know it came up in the Belfast climate plan discussions, you know, the lack of actual sort of expert advice, or the problem is you have to go to a private company, which inevitably is trying to sell you their particular element and their particular option. What's very difficult is getting somebody to give you advice on all of the options. And then finally, the reverse and decline in nature. I mean, again, I know from experience that a lot of environmental organizations have been working, particularly the land managing organizations, have been promoting nature-friendly farming for a very long time, and often using EU agri-environment incentives to do that. And I think, you know, we're now at the post-Brexit crossroads of seeing what will replace. I mean, people will say that European incentives are a mixture of environmentally damaging subsidies and environmentally positive agri-environment policies, but I think we're kind of looking at a bit of a vacuum now as to what will actually replace that space. And, you know, we kind of very much support the intention, anyway, of Action 5. So just really wanted to say that I think there's, you're pushing on an open door as far as the wider voluntary community sector is involved. And there are a lot of other, I think, discussions going on with which this aligns. So I'll leave it there.
That's great, Jeff. Listen, thank you very much. So now, folks, we have a good over half an hour for Q&A and so on. Could I particularly encourage young people and women to ask questions first? I do note there is a question in the chat, but I'm just going to give somebody else an opportunity if they'd like to. Just use the raised hand function and you can ask your question. Just try and make it a question and not a speech. Okay, so perhaps while you're, oh, there we have a hand up. Let me see. So Karen, do you want to come in there?
Okay, it's maybe more of a statement rather than a question. And it's really in relation to what Jeff has just said. Community, there's a wealth of experience in renewable energy and community renewable energy projects in Northern Ireland through Northern Ireland Community Energy and Drumlin Wind Energy. Unfortunately, Northern Ireland has been far behind its neighbouring regions in supporting community energy development. And this is part of the lobbying that we have been doing with government. We haven't had funding and finance for supportive bodies to grow community energy initiatives in Northern Ireland. And I would ask everybody that's joining today if they would support the lobbying that we're putting forward for a community energy policy for Northern Ireland. And that is really to grow community energy initiatives, which will help change the behaviours of citizens. Projects across Europe and the UK have shown that community energy projects change how people think about energy and about climate, and get more engaged in changing their habits and behaviours.
That's great. Karen, perhaps if you want to put a link in the chat for people that they can find out more information on how they can help, that would be great. But I don't know whether Declan, Cheryl or Jeff has any response to the kind of comment and issues that Karen has raised. Declan, sorry, I'm catching you mid-chew there. Apologies.
Sorry. Yeah, I think alternative models of ownership are going to be vital for the transition. There has to be community participation. I've talked about community participation quite a bit, but not just in the decision making, but also in the ownership. So cooperative models, for example, and I know that NICE and Drumlin are working on that kind of thing, pioneering those sorts of models. So they're going to be absolutely vital. And also we have a lot of public land. Councils own a lot of land. Government departments own a lot of land. We've got a lot of land tied up in the grounds of hospitals and schools and places like that. We could also be utilising that land to generate energy for public good. So you can have kind of models of ownership there that are kind of part publicly owned, part community owned. There are lots of examples across the world of different ownership models, but we can't continue to rely on big business coming in, trying to squeeze profit out of these energy schemes, because we end up with things like RHI and anaerobic digesters that are, just huge industrial complexes, or huge wind farms, that end up, with bog bursts and, all this kind of stuff. So we have to rethink our own models of ownership, and there has to be real tangible community benefits, not just a bit of a payoff for the local GAA club or for the church hall or something like that.
Okay. I don't know whether Cheryl or Jeff has any comment on this idea, which I really like, of taking over the energy means of production.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on the funding issue as well. I mean, I think I'm not sure if the point being made was the lack of capital funding, but that can very often be a real barrier. And there is something being talked about at the moment as part of the government's levelling up funds, which is the community ownership fund, which we understand there'll be a call out for in the summer at some point. I think there's still a lot of details to be worked out about that fund and some of the others, but the intention of that is to promote community ownership of assets. So there may be an opportunity there when we get more detail on that.
Thanks, Jeff. Cheryl?
Yeah, I come to all of this as a complete newbie, really, and I'm ashamed to know so little, but I assume that actually that's a strength for you to hear how little it's in the general consciousness that this stuff is being thought through, and the vocabulary even is, you have to go, okay, what's that? What's this? So in principle, I think it's a great idea to devolve power and not to have, devolve power as in production and power, but also, the ownership. I'm very much in favour of that in principle, but it doesn't solve the problem for us of human cantankerousness and the awkwardness and the abuse of power, which we should be very cautious of. You know, that the more power owners you have, the more you will have miniature fiefdoms and people exercising their power in ways that are dysfunctional. So for all, I've spoken very positively about you know, the new kingdom and all the goodness that can come from sharing. Let's not be naive about how that can be subverted, as we've seen with RHI. And yeah, so I'm just saying you'll need to keep talking to us and to keep unpacking this, and that it's probably worth maybe talking to Corrymeela, seeing if we can, because I know there are some folk in Corrymeela that are very faith-based, switched on to some of the stuff, and we may be able to work together to improve our understanding and to get these ideas that you're talking about more widely understood, and therefore people be less frightened of them when they understand them better.
That's great, Cheryl. I want to come to Nuala, who I think had a point to make. But before that, because Roy White in the chat has a very pertinent question on this very issue. Roy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Roy, are you unmuted? Oh, there you are.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I've forgotten what I wrote now.
Yeah, it was basically that you were concerned that if you give local communities back control, they may block renewable energy projects.
Yes, I think you've asked it well there.
Okay. Perhaps Declan, you know, this issue of, yes, we should empower communities, but the issue that Cheryl had raised as well, sometimes communities don't make the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely, that is a danger. But I think as long with, you know, along with decision making is also access to information, you know, these Aarhus principles. So, you know, we trust the wisdom of the commons and give people the right information or enough information, give them time to consider it, give them time to debate it and discuss it, and they come up with a good decision. Generally speaking, this has been shown time and time again. The problem is when you get vested interests trying to poison the discussion. So give people ownership is important. So so it's not simply about the decision making, but it's also about the ownership. So if people own the projects, if it's done in conjunction with the local authority, you know, council land or something like that, people are getting tangible benefits. The decision making is clear, transparent, democratic, participative. Then we just have to trust people to come to the right decisions.
That's great. But I might come to you, Jeff, on that issue. You know, given that, you know, you're representing the largest umbrella body for community and voluntary action, about this concern about what's the balance between, you know, decentralizing and empowering communities, and can we be sure that's always going to result in, you know, positive change in terms of the green transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a mixture of things there. You know, there's having the actual sort of capacity and resources to do things at a local community level, you know, needs to be in place. So, and I think as with many things, there needs to be a mixture. So, you know, when it comes to I suppose the path to net zero, if you like, it's going to have to be tackled at multiple levels. There's obviously, you know, I think there's a strong benefit in getting local communities involved, bought into, and, you know, actually even involved in developing their own energy, but it's probably not going to be the whole solution. And I think, you know, the whole area of community assets, there've been a lot of initiatives to try and promote this over the years, and I think people are still wrestling to some extent with it. So I don't think it's always straightforward. It's desirable, but I think there are models which some models are more successful than others. You know, there's even from previous experience in organisation, I used to work for the Woodland Trust, which had a lot of community woodlands, which they were trying to encourage into community ownership, but it wasn't a straightforward process. I think you need capacity. You often need skills as well, so that needs to be factored in.
Yes, Charles, do you have any comment on this?
No, I really don't think I have any light to bring just at the moment. Sorry, I'm pondering.
No problem.
If I could just come back in, John,
Sure, yeah.
I think, well, we have to change our mindset, and I think we're still very fixated on kind of ideas of replacing our big generators. So we've got, our big oil or gas power generators, and what do we do to replace those? And so we need big tech, big infrastructure to replace that. So let's have big wind farms and big solar farms, and let's develop, our marine technology, and we'll have big offshore wind farms or whatever it happens to be. But there are simpler things to do. First of all, energy efficiency. So let's just insulate everyone's house so that they're using less energy. Let's change our planning policies so that people don't have to drive to the shops. There isn't some big out of town or edge of town shopping centre with a huge car park taking up loads of valuable land. And renewables then at a local scale. So every house a generator. Every public building a generator. And once you put all that in place, then you begin to look at, well, what's left? What's the bit of the energy that we haven't yet tackled? That's when you start to look to larger larger projects, big wind farms or big solar farms or whatever it happens to be. But let's start small and scale up rather than just go immediately for this big scale, and you're just left with the problems then. Of course, local people don't want a big wind farm or a big solar farm on their doorstep. But if they've got solar panels on their roof and they've got heat pumps in the house, and they see that the council is using the land for ground source heat pumps or whatever it happens to be, whatever the appropriate technology is, and their homes are warm and cozy because they're well insulated, well, suddenly there doesn't become a need for these big infrastructure projects. There may well be some, but less of a need. So I think we're looking at it kind of back to front, start at the smaller scale and work up, the easy wins and work up, rather than, how do we completely transform this massive energy infrastructure?
Absolutely, Declan. Speaking as a small man, small is beautiful. You're absolutely correct on that one. So Nuala, you've been very patient. If you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. More comment than question. It was 2 comments, but now it's 3, because I thought the comments made about, communities might block things, or they might not make the right decision, or positive change. So that depends on who you are and where you're coming from. And in many cases, I mean, local communities, are living the experience and know exactly what needs to happen. But also, if you're sitting in Dara as the minister, and your idea of green growth would be completely different from many other people's ideas of green growth, and he would see that as positive change. So just that idea of what's right and what's positive, I thought was interesting. But I did want to make just 2 points. One about the renewable energies, and while we move towards that, Declan touched on this as well. We do have to be very mindful of how this impacts on people on other sides of the planet. And if we're going to be building large wind or offshore wind farms or whatever, and taking the lithium from Bolivia or Tibet or whatever, and ruining the livelihoods of people who live there, then that's not good to satisfy our energy demands by wrecking somebody else's life on the other side of the planet. And equally, this idea of offshore wind farms, a lot of them are, well, they'll say they're going to benefit local communities, they're there to power big data centres, and they're all still tied in with a capitalist model of growth, more efficiently, quicker. So we just have to be mindful of that. And also the schemes that are put in plan to support these renewable energy projects, the rock certificates, the way plants are built illegally, the impact on local communities physically and mentally. So all of that needs to be looked at. And the models of ownership that Declan talked about, I would just call it models of stewardship, because technically we have to recognise the rights of nature and the planet, and we don't own the place, or we don't own the planet. But one more point, I think, Declan, I think when you're saying when the climate bill goes through and we have to develop a climate plan as such, and that will have to come from the Assembly first, I think is what I picked out of it. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but I would actually say in much the same way that the climate bill came into the Assembly from activists, we would nearly be needing to start at community ground level and give the Assembly the climate plans that we want, not be waiting for them to initiate anything, because I wouldn't have much faith in what might be produced, because local communities know best, I think.
That's great,
and activists.
Nuala. That's great, thanks, Nuala. Declan.
Yeah, I mean, on that last point, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's just a recognition that that's where authority currently lies. But you're absolutely right that it should be a bottom-up process, not a top-down process. And you know, I take your point. It's well said. You're absolutely right about the impacts, and you know, I talked about that. It won't be a just transition if it requires us to destroy other people's environment. So this is where energy first comes into it. This is where a Green New Deal would come into it. Changing our planning policies to restructure communities so we're not so dependent on private cars, we're not so dependent on traveling long distances just to socialize, just to shop, just to go to the pub, whatever it happens to be. Not that you should be driving and going to the pub, but you know, we have created this scattered development pattern of development in Northern Ireland, and that's, you know, we need to completely rethink that. And yeah, I agree with everything that you said, really.
I mean, it's worth, you raise a really important issue, and I do fear on the back of Nuala's point that this rush towards, you know, particularly electric cars and so on, people don't realise that the rare earth metals that they require are indeed for wind turbines, and they are often extracted under the most horrendous environmental and human rights abusing conditions. And I think Declan's point is partly an answer to that. You know, the cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. We should be going for fabric first in terms of retrofitting people's houses that are using less energy, and maybe, and this is very rarely raised in this debate, maybe a low carbon regenerative future. It's not just a low carbon, but low energy, where we're actually using less energy rather than seeing it as how do we replace a quantum of, you know, of fossil energy with a quantum of renewable energy. And I think that issue needs to be raised, because I think that would help us get around some of those injustices that Nuala has you know, pointed out in terms of particularly that electrification of transport and wind turbines and so on, which we're going to need. There's no doubt about it, but there is a question about when how much of it is that we need, and therefore the big question in the and Declan's report, or Friends of the Earth report, directly addresses the issue that Nuala raised. Well, maybe we also have to look at growth, because it's growth in energy that's then driving growth in the economy. So if we want to have a low carbon and sustainable economy, maybe that's also then we have to go post growth. Now that's you'd be as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit for saying that, as I will be when I brief a DERA committee next week, but I'll let you know how I get on. But I don't know whether Jeff or Cheryl has something to say on that issue.
I have a lot to say about the farts and spacesuits. I'm an expert in those. You know, I found myself in a conversation last week about whether we should be going, this is on Sunday sequence, whether we should be going on foreign holidays this summer. And I'm trying to say, really, you know, there isn't a moral case for going, you know, and the other person is trying to say, well, of course, there's the economy there, and those people, they need our money. And I thought, yeah, well, they don't need your airplane inefficiencies and use of travel, and they don't need the bugs that you're going to bring with you, you know. But it is very difficult to say this stuff. It's very difficult to be the person that tells people that they can't have a new kitchen, or they shouldn't, you know, keep just reinvesting and tearing out what's perfectly usable in order to have the next trendy, most fashionable thing. And how we create a culture that values the reuse. You're talking about the energy efficiency of homes. I think that's a big one. And if we could get that into our workplaces and our homes, as you say, we could save an awful lot of damage by just using less. But it's about a spirit of chill out. You have enough already. You don't need this new stuff. And how do we get to there? And for me and for the faith community, you may be able to persuade the faith community that they have a critical role to play in helping people to understand the gift of enough.
Yeah, it is a tough one. You know, last time I looked, if you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, there is no right to consumerism. There is no right to convenience. But yet we've created a whole culture whereby people think that they do have a right to these things. And it's a difficult conversation, particularly just before I let Jeff in, particularly with working class communities or people are very little. And if you start going off about being anti-consumer, that's not what this is. The issue is enoughness. And that means some people don't have enough, as well as some people having too much of the wrong thing. So, but it is a difficult, I think the issue is the framing of it in a respectful way rather than a kind of a preachy manner, which I don't think is going to win people over at all. But anyway, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, picking up your point about starting with, efficiency and using less, and actually couching the discussion in terms of waste, because I think that people are fairly quick to get on board with things which waste both energy and money. And, that it seems so many years we've been pushing for retrofit of uninsulated homes and supporting that. It feels like unfinished business, and it's an obvious place to start. But also I think climate change is very often presented in a kind of but scientific, technological way, which I think maybe doesn't reach out to people. But if you see it as a waste issue, we're talking about the waste greenhouse gases from our consumption. So it is, in some ways, the marine litter issue has become very mainstream. Everyone knows about it now. So perhaps in the same way, people should think that there's also rubbish in our air, which we need to address, and not think of it as some technical issue, but actually an issue of how can we reduce our waste. And very often waste reduction is about saving money as well. I mean, the well-rehearsed arguments about food waste, people throw out a third of the food they buy in the UK. So, that it's a bit of a no-brainer, and it's the obvious place to start.
No, it's a really good point you're making. It could actually be another seminar we could put on is about what's the appropriate language, because you're right, a very technocratic scientific language, which is off-putting to a lot of people. They don't understand it, but they also sometimes feel patronized by it. And I do think there's something about what I call the fourth leg of sustainability. You had mentioned, Jeff, the social, economic and environmental, but I think the cultural is going to be a much more important part that we need to start understanding. And that it's almost like it's not what we can do for the climate. I mean, that's the kind of often male, technocentric, technological approach that we're going to solve the crisis in some way. I think it's about what's the crisis doing for us now? What are the opportunities in this existential moment of moral, cultural issues that we've raised already? I mean, Nuala was talking about global justice. I mean, these are the gifts in a way that the climate crisis can bring. I know that sounds bizarre, but it is about seeing that it's not necessarily what we can do for the climate, but what's the climate doing for us and affording us new ways of imagining the future. And that's what we don't often get enough of, because often not only is it viewed as a scientific issue that's for, politicians and technocrats, it's often viewed as something that's going to happen in the future, that's going to happen elsewhere, whereas actually it's happening here and now. But anybody else want to come in? We've got another couple of minutes. Yes, Callum.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. I've really enjoyed this session. Just actually picking up on particularly what yourself and Jeff were talking there about language.
Callum, if you can hear me, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
If you can, yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Yeah, so to start again, sorry, I think to pick up on what you were saying there, John, and also Jeff, about different language and approaching the language of transition and so on, and considering also the title of today's event, To Build Back Better. I was wondering, it would be interesting to know from the varying perspectives from Cheryl, Jeff and Declan, perhaps in reference to the report that Declan had presented, if they see how they see that language changing from the context of the pandemic, or the lessons learned that might be communicated to certain communities.
That's great. Callum, I don't know who'd like to go first, maybe Declan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic has, you hear so much more talk about well-being, about mental health, physical health as well, about valuing just like the small things, the small interactions, the friendships, familial connections, all the rest of it. So I think that some of that is kind of permeating into people's consciousness. On the flip side, you do also hear people saying, well, I just can't wait to get, back on my, whatever, my, skiing holiday or whatever it happens to be. So, it obviously hasn't completely saturated right through all layers, but you do hear more of that kind of gentler, smaller, slow. So yeah, we can build on that. I mean, I think language is very important. I mean, John talked about sustainable development. For me, I think this is an interesting debate about maybe linguists or anthropologists or people maybe looking at the development of language. In what way does our language dictate how we think, or how do we think dictate the language we use? So I'm inclined to think that language, to a large extent, dictates how we think or how we conceive of things. Because words have well, they don't have any intrinsic meaning, but they have usages, and usage kind of becomes almost unquestioning the particular definitions of words, and so you get a lot of equivocation going on. But sorry, I'm kind of rambling a little bit here. What was the point I was trying to make? Yes, about sustainable development. So how we look at sustainable development is very important, and the model that you see of the kind of the three pillars, where you have economic, social and environmental, and John has offered a fourth pillar of cultural, kind of holding up this concept of sustainable development. If you see it that way, then you can trick yourself into thinking, well, if we make the economy a big pillar and then the others are just like we skinny pillars, it'll still hold up sustainable development. So that's great, everything's done. But actually it doesn't work, because you see environmental decline, you see social communities being disrupted, or people being disenfranchised, or whatever it happens to be. So I prefer to think of it as not really this kind of balancing exercise that you typically get, but more of a synergistic exercise, where you're not looking at just seeing kind of like a tick box. Well, it benefits this quite well, but this not so much, but you can kind of compensate if we benefit this a bit. You're really looking at benefits across, maximized benefits across all the pillars, rather than trying to balance one against the other. So language, I think, is very important, and we start to change the way we talk about things. It may alter the way we think about them as well. Sorry, that was maybe a bit of a ramble at the end.
You ramble away, Declan. I'll ramble with you anywhere. Lovely to listen to you. I don't know whether Cheryl or Jeff have any quick remarks on that. You don't have to if you don't.
Well, it was just one thing. I was just thinking about how the language that we use to talk about climate change has sort of evolved over time. So people used to talk about global warming, and they talked about climate change. Now the language of net zero, approaching net zero. So it sort of strikes me that it's getting more action orientated, which is a good thing. we're past, hopefully, the stage of arguing about whether, you know, man-made climate change is happening, and it is much more about what are we going to do about it. And you know, it's obviously that's driven by the urgency of having to do something about it. But I do kind of feel that once things pass a bit more into the mainstream, then the language you use makes it more of a well, not quite a campaign, but I mean, it's something that you can get behind, something that you're part of. You know, whenever a law is passed around, no new internal combustion engines in cars in 2030, immediately drives business to start responding to that, which immediately will filter through to consumers who aren't really engaged in this and think that things are changing. And I think, you know, I've heard lots of criticism of net zero and people making too many, you know, glib net zero claims. But at the end of the day, what you're aware of is a whole range of organizations planning to take action, which is better than it was 10 years ago when it was just, you know, climate skeptics being put up in 50% sort of coverage with scientists. So I think we're moving forward, and the language is getting slightly reflecting that sort of slightly more practical action orientation, which is a good thing.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. Cheryl?
Yeah, my experience is that language is a very powerful tool for alienating people in the faith context, as you probably noticed. But that we win people when our language is more than our words. They've got to see that we care about them, and that it goes right through who we are. That's all I really want to say. You know, don't let the jargon and any individual target become a goal in itself, because you'll end up sacrificing people on a false god.
And that also touches upon Jeff's idea. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good in some ways. Now, folks, we're coming up towards the half hour. I think we can go a little bit over because nothing good ever starts or ends on time. So I have both Claire Bailey and Brian Heading with questions. So, folks, could you keep your questions short and sweet? Over to you, Claire, and then to Brian. Hello, Claire, are you there? Maybe you're on mute. Brian, why don't you jump in and then maybe Claire will come back.
I'm going to break the rules, John. I know you said, you know, to make the question short and stuff like that. But this is going to be a comment, and I think Mal O'Hara, who's a colleague on Belfast City Council, will sympathise with us, because we both run into, you know, when we're trying to raise things on behalf of constituents and we're trying to get policy changed at local government level, the first thing that we run into is the bureaucracy. That while we raise something, we get support from the other 58 councillors in the you know, that are in the chamber, and then everybody nods, and the officers that are available in the city council begin to nod and say, no, that's a very, very good idea. That'll deal with, for example, fuel poverty or planting trees. It's the length of time it takes to get an idea like that there onto somebody else's desk, to get them to sign off on it and to begin to get things moving on it. And believe me, you know, and I can see Miles nodding there, we both have knocked our pan in on issues like fuel poverty, about air pollution and air quality to do it. But it seems that, you know, as we go further up the pyramid of power, we begin to run into more and more layers of, we don't have the legislation for this. Well, we do have the legislation, but there's a problem about being able to do it as quickly as what is needed about it. And what's lacking is you mentioned it earlier on about the fourth stool, about there needs to be a cultural change. And part of that cultural change is there needs to be an urgency about cutting through the red tape and saying, look, if this works, why is it taking 18 months before something's actually implemented? to do it, and that's what needs to be done now. If it means that the power comes from these out of the civil servants, that's where I find the problem is. Civil servants are risk adverse, and they would love politicians to take responsibility for everything, but politicians are too cute about taking responsibility for anything these days. But civil servants and some local government officers, Mal, I'm sure you'll agree with me, others not so, but that's part of where the problem lies.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Well, speaking of politicians, we have another one waiting to get in. Claire, come on in.
Am I working yet?
There, we can hear you now.
Oh, sorry, technical problems. Apologies. Listen, I just want to give a bit of a blatant plug as well, but there's a lot of conversations, a lot of mentions about energy, and just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that the department have just gone to consultation on their energy policy. So it might be worth maybe even encouraging people to go on and submitting a response to that. And just if anybody is interested, so obviously you know that the climate bill has made its way through second stage. It's moved into committee stage now, and I fully expect it's going to look like a very, 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 very different bill by the time it's finished with its amendments and its processes, which is all absolutely fine. And, you know, it still had to be done. We're getting it in and everybody can continue to work on it. But part of the process that we're organising for this committee stage is a civic space. It's only been used by one department for one consultation before, but in order to try and galvanise as many views and take as much evidence as possible from wider civic society, there will be an online space for people to submit their views, because we just physically can't, as a committee, take all the evidence and hear from all the people that would like to. But I want to let you know that that's going to be happening too. And I'd say that in response to an issue Jeff said at the start when you started speaking, Jeff, you were saying that there's a lot of these papers, a lot of these conversations, a lot of these policies coming forward. And how do we sort of galvanise that into something solid that we can get as much support behind as possible? So my suggestion, it only is a suggestion, is to perhaps maybe have a look at all these papers. So NICFA have theirs, Friends of the Earth have theirs, loads of organisations have them, the Climate Coalition have them as well. But can we maybe try and pull all this together into a set of responses or agreed responses or suggestions, so people can use as a go-to sheet in order to submit those responses to the civic space, that we then as a committee can take on board and take those views as responses to the climate bill. And that's just a few. Yeah, and things that would be really getting teased out was, Declan mentioned a lot about the just transition and the just transition principles. And while that is written into the bill, it's not defined. So we haven't set down what the just transition principles are. I know what I want them to be, and I know what I want them to be shaped on, but there is the opportunity to feed into those. You know, how do you define sustainable development, for example? You know, use it as an opportunity to maybe try and really sharpen what it is the asks are and get them into the formal process from there. So that's just what I wanted to say on that.
That's great. Thank you, Claire. I think it's rather appropriate that the politicians were left to the end to make their contributions, which is a nice change for how things usually go. So listen, folks, I've got to bring things to a close and invite Caitlin back in to formally close the session. But thank you all. If you liked this discussion, and I think we haven't even touched upon all the issues that have been raised, get back in touch with ourselves and either in Friends of the Earth or in the Centre for Sustainability, and we can put on more of these events. I think we're going to need more of these discussions as we go forward. So please do see ourselves as a way of having conversations around these important issues. But Caitlin.
I don't have quite as well a crafted speech as I did at the beginning of the event, but yeah, no, the conversation today was just really good to hear. Doing activism is so often that you're criticized for trying to, I don't know, to promote like green industry and green energy, and you know, it's nice to see people really trying to take action on it and listening to the science and listening to the facts and not, I don't know, second guessing it or making excuses. So yeah, I think that's
That's great. Thank you, Caitlin. I think we could summarize it. That wonderful African-American novelist, Alistair Walker, has a lovely phrase, and I leave you with this. And she says, activism is the price I pay for living on this planet. And that's something that we should all think about. And so I'd just like to thank all our guests today, Declan from Friends of the Earth, Cheryl, the Reverend Cheryl Mabin, serial thought for the day person. Always make sure you're there early in the morning for the 2 slots. And also then Jeff Nuttall from NICFA. And can I also please ask you to give your thanks to Teresa Hill, our centre administrators, and an awful lot of work to make today happen. So listen, folks, take care. Have a restful weekend, hard won by the Labour movement. And especially for you, Cheryl, in the words of the old Irish comedian Dave Allen, may your God go with you. All right, listen, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.